You are closer than you think. And that is exactly why the last few months have been so hard to read. I need to ask you for something before we go one step further, and I'm asking it seriously. Do not listen to this one in pieces. Don't leave it playing while you scroll, because what I'm about to walk you through is not the kind of thing that lands in the first 30 seconds. It lands somewhere in the middle, when you recognize yourself in a story you thought was about somebody else. And if you're only half here, it will pass right over you the way it has passed over you before. Here is what I know, and I'm going to say it plainly. God does not answer out of nowhere. He never has. Before the miracle, there is always a signature, a set of things he does first, in a specific order, and every one of them looks like the opposite of an answer. That's why people miss it. They're watching the front door for a package and God is already working in the basement. They're waiting for the sky to open, and he's already moved 4 things in their life that they interpreted as loss. I'm going to name those things for you today. There are 5 of them. 5 things God shows a person right before he moves. And I'm telling you now, before we start, that at least one of these is going to describe the exact season you are standing in right now. Not vaguely, specifically. You will feel it in your chest a half second before your mind catches up. And that reaction is not your imagination. That is recognition. And recognition is how the Spirit has always spoken to people who are carrying something they can't yet name. One more thing. The 4th one is the one that explains the title of this video. And it's the one I'd stay for if I only had time for one. But you won't understand the 4th one until you've walked through the first 3. So stay with me. Let's begin. The first thing God shows you before a miracle is an inventory. He asks you what's left. There was a woman in the book of 2 Kings whose husband had died. And he had been a good man, one of the sons of the prophets, a man who feared God. And the creditors came anyway. That's the part nobody preaches. Being faithful did not exempt her household from collapse. The debt outlived the man, and the law of that day permitted a creditor to take a debtor's children as servants until the debt was cleared. So she is standing there with 2 boys and a notice. And the clock is running. She goes to Elisha. And Elisha does not pray for her. He does not lift his hands, or prophesy, or send her home with a promise. He asks her a question that must have felt almost cruel. What do you have in the house? Think about that for a second. She came because she has nothing. That's the whole reason she's standing there. And the first thing God does through his prophet is make her go look again. Her answer is one of the most honest sentences in the Bible. She says, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a little oil." Nothing. Except. That word, except, is the entire miracle. She didn't know it yet. She was apologizing for the oil. She was listing it the way you list a broken thing, embarrassed that it's all she could produce. And the whole of what God was about to do in her life would come out of the thing she almost didn't mention. And here's what most people miss. God did not send new oil. He multiplied the oil that was already in her house. He didn't import a miracle from somewhere else. He filled every empty container she could find with a supply she already had and had already dismissed. So let me ask you the same question he asked her. What's in your house? Not what's gone. You've counted what's gone. You've counted it at 2 in the morning more times than you'd admit to anybody. I'm asking what's left. The small thing. The thing you keep apologizing for. The ability you have that never made you any money. The stubbornness that your family calls difficult. The tenderness that made you cry at a commercial last week and made you feel foolish for it. The one relationship that survived. The $40. The one skill you learned in a job you hated. There's a man I know in a town outside of Dayton who lost a business he'd built for 19 years. Lost the building, lost the trucks, lost the name over the door. And when he finally stopped bleeding long enough to think, the only thing he had left was a phone full of numbers, every subcontractor, every supplier, every foreman in 3 counties who trusted him. He thought that was worthless. You can't eat a contact list. 2 years later, that phone was the whole business. He doesn't own trucks now. He connects people. He makes more than he ever made with the building. That was in his house the entire time. He was calling it nothing. When God starts asking you what's left, instead of comforting you about what's gone, you are not being audited. You are being staged. The inventory always comes before the increase. Because God multiplies what's in your hand, and He can't multiply a thing you refuse to admit you're holding. The second thing God shows you before a miracle is a subtraction. This is the one that breaks people. Because right at the point where you would expect Him to add resources, allies, momentum, energy, He starts removing things instead. And it feels exactly like abandonment. Gideon had 32,000 men. He was outnumbered anyway. The enemy camp is described as lying in the valley like locusts, camels beyond counting. 32,000 was already not enough. And God says, the people are too many. Too many. So He tells Gideon to send home anyone who's afraid. And 22,000 men walk away in a single afternoon. Gideon watches 68% of his army disappear over the hills. And before he can even absorb that, God says it again. There are still too many. Then comes the strangest test in the Old Testament. Take them down to the water and watch how they drink. The ones who kneel and put their faces in the stream go home. The ones who stay standing, who lift the water to their mouths and keep their eyes on the horizon, stay. 300 men, out of 32,000. Now, I want you to feel what Gideon felt walking back to camp that night. He didn't feel chosen. He felt stripped. Every subtraction God performed made his situation objectively worse. By every measure, a man can measure. And God's explanation is the sentence that should be carved above every door in your life. Lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. The subtraction wasn't punishment. It was authorship. God was removing every explanation for the victory except Himself. That's what's been happening to you. The friend who stopped calling. The opportunity that fell through in the last week when it had already been verbally promised. The plan B that quietly stopped being available. You have been reading that as the door closing. It isn't. It's God removing the alternate endings, so that when the thing happens, there is not one single person in your life, including you, who can explain it any other way. I met a woman in Sacramento who spent 4 years trying to get a nonprofit off the ground. Every year a big donor would come close and back out. Every single year. She told me she used to sit in her car and beg God to just let one of them say yes. In year 5, it happened without any of them. A piece of property was left to her organization by a woman she'd met exactly twice, at a hospital, sitting with someone else. She told me she cried, and then she laughed, because she understood in one instant why every check had fallen through. She would have spent the rest of her life thanking a donor. If God is subtracting, He's not done. He's clearing the room, so there's nobody left to take the credit. The third thing God shows you before a miracle is a stillness that feels like being ignored. This one is quieter than the others, and it hurts in a different way. The subtraction at least feels like something is happening. This one feels like nothing is happening at all. There's a moment in the book of Ruth that I don't think gets talked about enough. Ruth has done everything right. She left her country. She buried her husband. She stayed with a bitter old woman who told her plainly there was no future in it. She went out into a field at harvest and worked in the heat behind strangers, picking up what the reapers dropped, which is one of the most humbling forms of labor described in Scripture. And then Boaz notices her. He speaks to her. The whole thing is set in motion. And Naomi tells her, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will fall. Sit still." After all that walking, after all that work, the instruction, at the exact moment things start to move, is to stop moving. Because Naomi understood something Ruth couldn't see from where she was standing. The matter was no longer in Ruth's hands. There was a negotiation happening at the city gate that morning, between men she had never met, about a piece of property and a family name, and a nearer kinsman who had first right of refusal. Her entire future, her marriage, her son, the line that would run down through David to Christ himself, was being settled in a conversation she was not invited to and could not have influenced. And the only correct thing for her to do was sit still. I want you to hear that if you are in a season where your prayers have gone quiet and every door you push on feels padded, there is a difference between God ignoring you and God transacting on your behalf in a room you're not in. Ruth, sitting in that house, was not passive. She was positioned. The work was finished. What remained was not hers to do. There's a school teacher in a town near Little Rock who told me she spent an entire summer convinced God had forgotten her. She had applied for a position she wanted badly, interviewed well, and then heard nothing for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of checking her email at 6 in the morning. What she found out later was that the woman whose job she was applying for had not actually decided to retire yet, and spent that summer praying about it in a kitchen 4 miles away. 2 women, 4 miles apart, praying about the same desk, neither one knowing the other existed. That's a gate she was never invited to, and there was nothing she could have done at it if she had been. I know how that feels, and I want to be honest with you about my own life before I say anything else, because I don't want to stand here sounding like a man who has only ever watched this from the outside. My name is George, and if you've been walking with this channel for a while, you know I don't tell you things I haven't lived. There was a stretch of about 2.5 years where I did everything I knew how to do and nothing moved. I prayed the way you pray when you're desperate, not eloquently, just repetitively. The same 3 sentences over and over in the truck, in the garage, standing at the sink at 11 at night with the water running so nobody would hear me. And heaven was silent. Not hostile, silent, which was worse. And I did what I suspect you have done. I started building a case against myself. I decided the silence was a verdict. I went back through my life, looking for the sin that had disqualified me. And I found plenty of candidates. Because a man searching for reasons to feel condemned will always find them. I was sure that God had moved on and left me a polite, permanent distance. What I know now, what I did not know then, and what cost me 2 years of unnecessary grief, is that I was not being ignored. I was in the third thing. I was sitting still while a matter was being settled at a gate I couldn't see. And when it broke in about 9 days. 9 days undid 2.5 years. And the whole time I had been reading the silence as rejection, it had been preparation. I'll tell you the part I'm least proud of. When it finally moved, my first honest emotion was not gratitude. It was anger. Because I understood in that moment how much of those 2.5 years I had spent afraid, and how much of that fear had been unnecessary, and how differently I would have carried myself if I had simply known what season I was standing in. I wasn't grieving the wait. I was grieving how I waited. The reason I'm telling you this is that somewhere in the middle of that season, Somebody put something in my hands that named what was happening to me. Not a sermon, not a pep talk, a framework, language for a thing I was living blind. And it did not make the waiting shorter, I want to be honest about that, but it made the waiting survivable. Because I finally knew which part of the process I was standing in instead of assuming I'd been dropped from it. That is the whole reason the next thing exists. There are messages that pass through your eyes, and there are messages that pass through your spirit. If something in you recognized itself while watching, don't dismiss it. That is the spirit confirming what was already written. The secret protocol carries 7 keys that unveil what heaven deposited in you before you ever arrived, things no one around you has ever been able to name. It comes with the full audiobook for your moments of prayer, silence, and encounter with God. And you also receive the Awakening Map, the guide that illuminates the 5 seasons of spiritual awakening, revealing with precision exactly where you are and what comes next. The link is pinned in the first comment, but only for a limited time. Don't let this moment pass without a response. Now, the 4th thing. This is the one I told you to stay for. The 4th thing God shows you before a miracle is that He starts moving somebody else. Not you, somebody else. Somebody who has no idea you exist yet. In the 9th chapter of Acts, there's a man named Ananias, living in Damascus, minding his life. He is not a famous man. He gets a handful of verses in the entire Bible, and then he's gone. And God speaks to him in a vision and gives him an assignment with an address attached. Arise, and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth. I want you to notice the specificity of that. A street name, a house, a host's name, a man's name and his hometown, and a status report on what that man is doing at this exact moment. Meanwhile, Saul is sitting in that house blind, 3 days without sight, 3 days without food or water. Everything he'd built his identity on had collapsed on a road in a single afternoon. He had no idea help was coming. He had no way to arrange it. He couldn't see to walk out and find it. He was just sitting in the dark in a stranger's house, praying, and heaven had already dispatched a man with his address. Ananias, for his part, argued. He said, "Lord, I have heard about this man and the harm he's done." He didn't want the assignment. And God's answer was essentially, "Go anyway. He is a chosen vessel unto me." Here's the piece I need you to sit with. Saul did not know Ananias's name. Ananias did not know Saul's face. Neither man arranged that meeting. It was arranged in heaven, with an address, and executed by a man who almost said no. You have prayed for a door. You have never once considered that the door might be a person who hasn't met you yet, and that God may already be working on them tonight, without your knowledge and without your involvement. Do you understand what that means about the phone call you keep waiting for? About the resume you sent that vanished? Somebody has to open that envelope. Somebody has to remember your name in a meeting. Somebody has to be sitting in a room where a decision is being made and think of you unprompted. And you cannot make any of that happen. But God can move a man to a street called Straight. And He can move somebody to your street too. The same thing happens with Philip. He's in the middle of a citywide move of God, in Samaria crowds, healings. The whole place stirred, and an angel pulls him out of it and sends him south to a desert road for one man in a chariot, reading a scroll he couldn't understand. That is what I mean when I say, this was sent directly to you. You are not part of a crowd God is handling generally. He will absolutely position somebody for you. Which brings us to the last one, and it's the one that changes what you do tomorrow morning. The 5th thing God shows you before a miracle is a sign you have to hang up while the walls are still standing. There was a woman in Jericho named Rahab. She had a reputation in that town that followed her everywhere, and her house was built into the city wall itself, which tells you exactly how much she was worth in the eyes of that city. Not central, built into the barrier. 2 spies came through. She hid them, and she told them something remarkable. She said, "We have heard what your God did at the Red Sea, and our hearts melted." The whole city knew. The whole city was terrified, and not one other person in Jericho acted on it. She made a deal for her family, and the spies gave her an instruction. Bind this line of scarlet thread in the window. Now think about the timing of that. She had to tie that cord in her window immediately, and then live behind it. For days, while the walls were still up, while her neighbors walked past and saw a red cord hanging out of the wall of the woman everybody talked about. She had no way to prove anything was coming. There was no siege yet, no trumpets, nothing but a piece of thread and a promise from 2 foreigners she'd hidden under flax on her roof. Then the army came and did the strangest thing anybody had ever seen. They walked once a day for 6 days in silence. Rahab watched that from her window with that cord hanging beside her. 6 days of an enemy army doing nothing but walking in a circle and going home. Every single day would have looked like more evidence that she'd bet her family's life on nothing. On the 7th day, the wall came down, and the one section of wall that did not fall was the section with her house in it. That's the 5th thing. Before God moves, He asks you to act on the promise while the evidence still says no. To hang the cord up, to sign the lease, make the call, finish the manuscript, register the business, forgive the person, get the certification, tell your wife you believe it's going to turn before anything visible has changed. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not talking about being reckless with your family's rent money. I'm talking about the one specific thing you know God has told you to do, that you have postponed until the situation improves. You have made your obedience conditional on your circumstances. Rahab's obedience preceded her circumstances by 7 days, and that cord in the window was not what saved her, but it was the evidence that she believed she'd be saved. Faith that waits for proof isn't faith. It's arithmetic. And notice what the cord actually cost her. It was visible. That's the part that stings. She could have believed privately and kept her window empty, and nobody in Jericho would have known she'd thrown in with a god the city was afraid of. The cord made her position public before her position was vindicated. Which is exactly what God is asking of you in the thing you keep postponing, not just to obey, but to obey where people can see it, before you have anything to show them. So let me put all 5 where you can see them at once, because I want you to be able to locate yourself. He asks you what's left in the house. He removes the things that could take the credit. He tells you to sit still while the matter is settled somewhere you can't see. He starts moving people you haven't met. And he asks you to hang a red cord in a window while the wall is still standing. If you're standing in one of those, you're not behind. You're in the corridor. And nobody stands in a corridor forever. Now here's what I'm asking from you, and I want it to be specific, because vague comments don't do anything for either of us. Tell me which one you're standing in. 1 through 5. Just the number, but then tell me the detail. If it's the first one, tell me the small thing that's still in your house that you've been calling nothing. If it's the second, tell me what got removed this year that you're still angry about. If it's the third, tell me how long the silence has lasted, in months. If it's the fourth, tell me the name of the door you're praying will open. And if it's the fifth, Tell me the one thing God has told you to do that you've been waiting for better conditions to do. I read these. And I want to say something about that. When you write it out, in your own words, with the actual detail in it, something settles in you that doesn't settle when you only think it. Naming it is part of it. It always has been. This channel is created without ads and without platform income. If these messages have touched your heart, strengthened your faith, or helped you during a difficult moment, and you'd like to support this work, you can use the CR code on your screen or the contribution link in the pinned comment. Thank you for walking this path with us. And one last thing about that widow, because I left part of the story out on purpose. Elisha told her to borrow vessels, empty ones, and he said, do not borrow a few. She sent her sons out to every neighbor in the village, and they came back with jars, and she shut the door behind them and started pouring, and the oil kept coming, and her boys kept handing her containers, and she kept filling them one after another, after another. And then one of them said, there is not a vessel more. And Scripture says the oil stopped, not because the supply ran out, because the containers did. She never found out how much oil there was. Nobody ever has. The only limit that ever showed up in that house was the number of empty jars she was willing to go ask her neighbors for, while she still looked like a woman with nothing. So, go get more jars.